Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to bring you my July wrap-up. In total, in July, I ended up reading 14 books slash graphic novels and comics. This is the most that I have ever read in terms of the number of things as well as in terms of the number of pages. So the total page count for the month of July ended up being 3,800, which is the most that I have ever read. But yeah, anyways, without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the books because we have a lot to talk about. So the first book that I finished in the month of July was Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. This was a reread for me. I haven't read this series in a while, and I started doing a reread in preparation for the prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I finished this one at the very beginning of the month and I absolutely adored this. This is one of the best books that I have ever read, and definitely probably the best sequel that I have ever read to anything. Well, maybe except for Crooked Kingdom, because I just love Six of Crows so much. But this sequel is crazy good. I'm not gonna go into what the Hunger Games is about, but if you haven't read it in a while, or if you haven't read it at all, I urge you to pick it up, especially if the prequel interests you. This series is so well written and so good, and I'm reading The Mockingjay right now, and I'm going through all the feelings, and I just can't wait until I finish it and I can dive into the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. 5 out of 5, obviously, it was amazing. So the next book that I read was actually an audiobook that I listened through script, and that was Love Boat Taipei by Abigail Hing Wen. Basically, the story is about this Chinese American girl. They live in America with her family, but then her family suddenly decides to send her on this trip to Taipei to kind of learn her roots and her culture and make some good Asian friends. And so she's very unhappy about being sent against her will, especially because she really wants to concentrate on dance, and she was planning to dedicate the whole summer to dance, but they're actually sending her off for the entirety of the summer and she won't be able to participate in this competition that she wanted to and things like that. But the catch is, and I think it's described a little bit inaccurately on the synopsis, but this program is not necessarily so study focused. It's not very strict on observing its students and just doing all of these cultural things. It's basically a bunch of teenagers kind of being given free rein to do whatever they want, which is what the synopsis says, but it's not necessarily true. It's just that teenagers, despite the rules being in place, still sneak out and do whatever they want. And so she meets some friends and she just gets into a lot of teenage trouble. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I think I read it in less than 24 hours. I just listened to it on audiobook because I was really feeling something light, and I've been hearing good things about this contemporary. And again, just like pretty much every contemporary ever that I will ever review, I didn't care too much for it. It was cute, it was fun. I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't bad, but I don't care for it, and honestly, until I started talking about, I couldn't even remember half of the things that happened. It's been less than a month since I read it, and I'm already forgetting all of the details, so it doesn't say anything about the quality of the book. I think the book is good for those who do enjoy reading contemporary. I usually read contemporary when I just don't want to get into this like whole fantasy mood, reading something dark. When I want to switch gears and read something light, that's why I read contemporary. Not because I just want to talk about something I hate, because I don't hate it. It's just never really too impressive for me. That's it. So the next book that I completed in July was An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. I also listened to this on audiobook, and it was a very quick, fluffy fantasy read. It's one of those fantasies that is very light and not very in-depth in terms of magic and world building and things like that. I picked this up because I just wanted something light. I was in a very specific mood for a light, fluffy fantasy. I didn't want to read another contemporary. I wanted magic, but I also didn't want anything too in-depth and complex, so I just picked this one up, and going into it, I already knew that this wasn't going to be anything super crazy. I knew what I was getting myself into. This is basically a fairy romance fantasy. The Enchantment of Ravens follows our main protagonist, who is a painter, and she gets commissioned a lot by Fae because Fae are not able to create their own art in any form, so they can't draw, paint, they can't cook, they can't make pottery, they can't do anything that could be considered as any form of art. And so our main character, because she's a painter, she has a lot of fake lines, and she's actually a very prolific, famous painter in this world. And so one day she gets commissioned to draw a portrait of the fall court Fey prince, and she accidentally paints sorrow into his eyes, and so she gets in trouble for that because Fae aren't supposed to show any human emotion, so he has to take her and bring her to his court to be prosecuted for this crime that she committed. Basically, that's the whole premise. This is about their journey going there and all of the things that kind of happen. But truly, this is a very quick, fluffy romance fantasy read about a girl and a fairy prince. I knew what I was getting myself into. I was happy to read it. I don't think this is a masterpiece by any means, but I did give it like 3.5, 3.75 stars just because I really enjoyed it. It wasn't anything special, but I enjoyed it, and it was also very quick. So if you're in a mood for this type of book, I would recommend checking it out, but know going in that it's not gonna blow you away by any means. It's not a super complex fantasy world. It's very much low-key fantasy about Fae, and there's not too many details about the world in general, so don't go looking for that in this book. So the next book that I finished was The Institute by Stephen King, which is very different from all of the previous books that I talked about, but it's basically about this boy who gets kidnapped in the middle of the night and placed in this institute for children with special abilities, and basically the institute performs experiments on them. That's all you really need to know going into this book. The premise was interesting, and overall I really enjoyed the Stephen King writing. This was my first Stephen King novel that I ever read. I definitely liked the tone of the book and how it was written, and overall I enjoyed the book, but the ending was a little bit anticlimactic. This was a book that I read as part of my book club with two of my friends, and I think we all agreed on the fact that the book was interesting, but the premise was a little bit more exciting than the execution, and the ending was a little bit of a letdown. Overall, I gave this book 4 stars. I still enjoyed it. It was a big chunker of a book, and I think out of the 3 of us in the book club, I personally enjoyed it the most. And I'm definitely excited to see other works by Stephen King, because I know this isn't his most popular or strongest work by any means, but I definitely enjoyed it. And overall, I would recommend it if it's the type of story that you're looking for, but just be prepared that the ending is not this epic thing that you might imagine. So the next couple of books that I'm going to be talking about, I read as part of the Reading Rush. So the Reading Rush was held from July 20 to 26, and in total I did end up reading 7 books. Overall, I did pretty well, and the first book that I completed for it was Her Nun by Agatha Christie. I think most people are familiar with this story, but Her Nun is about this group of people who gets invited to this mysterious island by the owner that they all don't really know. They all kind of have an incentive to go. There's this famous little children's rhyme about 10 little soldiers who all get killed in a specific type of way, and from the very beginning people start dying exactly in the way that the rhyme describes. So I ended up giving this book around 3.5 stars. I did give it 4 stars in the beginning, but then I bumped it down to about 3.5 because looking back on it, I don't really care too much about the story. I don't think it was anything crazy or mind-blowing. While I didn't guess who was the culprit and how everything was set up, I wasn't very surprised, which is, I guess, an interesting thing to say, but I wasn't surprised that it was the person/people that it was. I just thought that it definitely showed that it was written quite a while ago. It's not a book that by today's standards for thrillers and murder mysteries would hold up, I think. I appreciate what Agatha Christie did for the genre in general, but I think the genre definitely developed and evolved more from the time that she was writing in it, and the books that I have read since, I have enjoyed more than I did this one. I definitely want to give The Murder on the Orient Express a shot because I think it's an even more beloved book than Her Nun, and I do want to read more in this genre. But yeah, I'm glad that I read this because Agatha Christie is definitely a famous figure in this genre, and I'm glad that I familiarized myself with her work. So overall, no regrets, but I wasn't super blown away by the book. On another note, there is a book, or specifically a graphic novel, that I was definitely blown away by, and that is Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero O'Connell. I love this graphic novel so much. If you watched my Reading Rush vlog part 1, you will know how much I enjoyed this. I was just sitting and gushing about this book for forever. Yeah, I couldn't shut up about how much I enjoyed this book because it was everything that I wanted, and I never thought that I could actually like a graphic novel as much as I like this one. Not only is the story very touching and interesting and important, but the illustration style is absolutely gorgeous. So if you're not familiar with this graphic novel, it's basically about this girl, Freddie, who has this horrible girlfriend, Laura Dean, who keeps breaking up with her. And basically, this is Laura Dean's journey trying to figure out what she wants from a relationship, why she can't let go of Laura Dean, and who she is as a person. And it's also a story about friendships and the importance of friendships. Overall, this was so touching and so beautifully executed. There was nothing that I didn't like about this book, except for Laura Dean, because Laura Dean was horrible. The characters I definitely felt for. Considering this is a graphic novel, I was surprised how much I cared about the characters, and the way that the art style balanced the story was just absolutely satisfying. This graphic novel definitely didn't have the problem of overtelling, where the story and visuals just did too much for me. This was just perfect, and overall I would highly recommend it. If it's not obvious, I did give it 5 stars, and I will be rereading it at some point, and overall would just highly recommend it to anyone. And also, just to shout out, this one has a lot of LGBTQIA plus representation, so if you ever need a good read with LGBTQIA plus representation for a readathon or something, pick this up. Basically, I just urge you to read this book. Just do it. It's amazing. And the next book that I completed for the Reading Rush was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So this is my first full Neil Gaiman novel that I completed, despite me owning like 15 Neil Gaiman books. This book I ended up giving around 3.25 stars. I wasn't very impressed with the story. I definitely didn't get out of it what I wanted to. However, it wasn't by any means bad or unenjoyable. It was just very middle of the road for me. If you're not familiar with the story, it's basically about this man who comes back to his old childhood home, and he starts reminiscing about his past because when he was a boy, a man that was renting a room in their house was found dead in their car at the end of their lane. And from there on, some weird things started happening, and the boy just got in this magical, weird situation. I just wasn't satisfied with the ending as much. I really wanted more things explained. I don't like when things are just left open-ended and unexplained and open to imagination. I really want to know what the author meant, what is happening, and I really want everything to be well tied together. And if you're like me and you need that, don't look for it in this book. Some things are answered, but overall it's not very thorough in explaining what the things that take place in this book are, why they happened, how it works. The magic that happens in this book is very whimsical, and you just have to suspend your disbelief. It doesn't really make sense, and it's never explained. So if you don't like that kind of stuff, I honestly wouldn't recommend this book. But if you're a diehard Neil Gaiman fan, if you like magical realism and you don't mind open endings, pick this book up, because I know a lot of people like it. I just didn't really care for it too much. Okay, and the next book that I completed for the Reading Rush was Sheets by Brenna Thumler, and oh my god, guys, I think this is my favorite read of the year. officially, I think this has beat Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, and it has beat The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I enjoyed this so much, and I just want more. When I found out that the sequel to this, Delicates, was coming out next year, not this year, I was honestly heartbroken because this is an amazing, amazing graphic novel. This is a story about Marjorie, who has recently lost her mother, and she is left to run a laundromat on her own, which is her family business, because her dad is kind of no longer really present. He's very heartbroken and he can't seem to be doing anything. So everything has fallen on the shoulders of Marjorie, who is, by my approximations, in grade 8 or 9. So while Marjorie is trying to save her family's business from falling apart because people are trying to sabotage her and buy her out, she meets Wendell, who is this very cute ghost. But Wendell is also grappling with his own problems. He doesn't want to accept that he is dead, and he can't seem to be able to grapple with the fact of how he died. And so Wendell and Marjorie meet, and then it's just a cute story about friendship. And honestly, despite all of the sad things about this book, it was so funny. I laughed so much when reading this, and this is specifically why I would recommend this to anyone. This is so funny. Brenna Thumler is honestly a genius. I applaud her. Not only is she super talented in her art style, as you can see, this is beautifully drawn. Not only is she an amazing illustrator, but she also managed to write such a funny and cute and amazing story. This book is appropriate for all ages. If you have any siblings or children who are in middle grade age range, I would highly recommend this. But also, I highly recommend it even if you're an adult to read this, because honestly, this was so amazing. I don't want to discourage anyone who doesn't like middle grade from picking it up, because I wouldn't consider it middle grade. It's just middle grade appropriate. But this is definitely the type of story that no matter what your age is, you would be able to enjoy and get something out of. I personally laughed so much while reading this. I don't know if I'm target audience for this or not, but this was an amazing, and it did so much for me. And honestly, I cannot wait to read more of Brenna Thumler's work in this series and in the future in general. I just applaud her for writing this beautiful graphic novel, and I would highly recommend you pick this up. And if it wasn't obvious, this was 5 stars. Okay, and the next book that I read for the reading rush was Department of Speculation by Jenny Offel, which is a very short book, and I actually listened to it on audiobook, and it's basically a story of one woman's life, and specifically her marriage and her being a mother, and just her trying to grapple with the reality of her marriage and of her being a mother. It's very beautifully written and very in-depth, interesting book that has so much hidden in it. When I was reading it, I just felt stupid because I felt like there was so much that I wasn't understanding. It was written in a very interesting, whimsical way, but not in terms of it being magical or anything like that. It was just poetic. It was almost like it was written in verse, but not quite. And it was so beautiful, thoughtful. I definitely want to buy a physical copy and go through it again and annotate it and look up different things about this novel, because it definitely packs a lot in such a small amount of pages. And I gave this book 4.5 stars. If you want to read something interesting with a poetic writing style and something that definitely challenges you a little bit and makes you really think about what you're reading, I would highly recommend picking this up. I really enjoyed Jenny Offel's writing style, and I want to pick up more books by her. And overall, I really enjoyed this book and would highly recommend you pick it up. And so the second to last book that I completed for the Reading Rush Readathon was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So I've had this book on my to-be-read pile for forever. While I wasn't blown away by this book, I am definitely glad that I finally read this classic, and I can say that I know what it's about. I will know the references, things like that. I'm not gonna explain what The Great Gatsby is about because I think most people know it's a classic and I think most people have read this too. So instead I'm gonna talk about what the different things that I marked are about because I just find it personally funny what I decided to mark. So the purple tabs are the tabs for whenever Tom was being a complete asshole, when he was being a garbage human. So he was being a garbage human the entire book. But these purple tabs are for very specific times where he very specifically said or did something insensitive or horrible, and I just wanted to mark it, even though it just flowed in and out from one horrible thing to another. But I just hated Tom so much that I had to mark every bad thing that he did. The green tabs are for problematic things other characters other than Tom said or did. Yeah, I just wanted to really critically look at this book and try to understand what problems it has, considering it takes place 100 years ago and it was written about that amount of years ago. It definitely has its problems, even though I think F. Scott Fitzgerald did realize certain things as being unfair or insensitive. There are still some things that are problematic in this book that show the time that it was written, and yeah, I just wanted to be critical about that. And the blue tabs, which I don't have too many of, but they are quotes or parts of the book that I enjoyed. There's this quote that is at the end of the book, but it doesn't spoil anything, but I just think it really encapsulates the behavior of basically everyone in this book, but specifically the two characters that it talks about. And it goes like this. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. So that definitely encapsulates the vibe of the book. It's about so many people just being rich and stupid and careless. So yeah, I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed that I was able to look at it from a critical perspective because I don't do it as often. So I'm glad I was able to read this book. And also just to say, I love Nick so much. He is such a great person. Aside from one green tab that is dedicated to something that he said, I really enjoyed reading from his perspective. So, okay, we're getting there. Just a little bit more. So the next 2 books that I read were Giant Days Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 I did read as part of the reading rush, and Volume 2 I read afterwards. And Giant Days is a comic series about these 3 girls who are starting university, and basically just about the things that they encounter in university: relationships, friendships, different things that people go through when they go through university. And overall, I really enjoyed especially the first volume. It was hilarious. It was so funny. I really liked the characters. I think I gave the first volume 4.5 stars and the second one 4 stars. I definitely think that the humor was a little bit better in the first volume than it is in the second one. And now that I'm reading the third one, I think it's also kind of staying at the 4-star mark. But overall, it's still super enjoyable, super fun. And I would highly recommend you this comic series if that's something that you're interested in. I never thought that I would ever be able to enjoy comic books or graphic novels, but here I am. July has really changed me. Now I'm on a roll. Now I want all the graphic novels and comic books. So please, if you have any good recommendations that are anything like Sheets, Lorraine Keeps Breaking Up With Me, or Giant Days, let me know down below. I'm just having a really good time with this whole new world that opened up to me. So the next book that I finished was In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle, and this is an adult contemporary novel. This book is about a woman who is doing really well in her career. She just got engaged to her long-term boyfriend right after all of these major changes in her life happen. She falls asleep and wakes up in a completely different apartment with a completely different man wearing a different engagement ring. And she basically sees the very small part of her life that she's going to have in 5 years. And so after she falls asleep again, she wakes up back in her normal life. And she is now consumed with the idea of what happens, how come things end up being the way they are, and she's doing everything she can to prevent that from happening because she doesn't want to break up with her fiance. She doesn't want to move to that different apartment, but slowly things start happening that kind of lead to that future, even though she's trying really hard to prevent it. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I definitely didn't see where it was going, and it didn't end the way that I expected, or I guess it didn't end up why I expected. Overall, this book did surprise me. There was one thing that I didn't see coming at all. I didn't know it was happening, and I'm not gonna say what it is because I do think it will be a spoiler. I don't remember it being in the synopsis, so I'm not gonna say what it is, but there is something that happens in this book that is so unexpected, and it really sent me personally spiraling. I really started thinking about a lot of things, and I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil the book, but it definitely got me thinking, and it got me a little bit crazy about some things that related to what happened in the book. I really enjoyed this book. I would say I give this 4.25 stars. It's a very enjoyable adult contemporary. I really enjoyed the way that our main character was written. She was very different from the characters that I usually see. She has a very different perspective than most characters that I read from. And overall, I just felt like this book was very solid, and I feel like it was written just right. I wouldn't change anything about how it was written or where the story went, even though maybe I would have wanted a different ending. Overall, I do think the execution was really good, and I would highly recommend checking this book out if it sounds like something you would like. I think it goes by really fast, and it definitely plays at your heartstrings, so I would recommend it for that. And so the very last book that I completed in the month of July was an audiobook by Chidera Egeru, and it was What a Time to Be Alone. So this is a non-fiction, kind of like self-help book, basically about being your own self. I would say that this is a pep talk for people who don't feel complete on their own and who feel like they're not good enough for whatever reason. And it's also for people who I think are trying to seek external validation from others. Personally, I didn't need this book. I personally read this book because Leora from Books with Leo recommended it on one of her recent videos. I don't want to get into TMI, but basically I just really want to read more books about single people for single people because it's something that is, you know, part of my life, and I just miss that in literature. So that was one of the books on her list. So I picked it up. And overall, I think this book is good. It just was definitely not for me. I actually give the same advice that the author of this book was giving in the book to my friends personally. So I didn't really need to listen to it, but while I was listening to it, I was like, oh, I definitely know some people that need to hear this, because this is something that I keep telling my friends, but they just don't listen to me. So I'm definitely gonna be recommending this book to some of my friends. But yeah, overall, I think if you find yourself struggling to feel whole on your own, especially now that we're in a pandemic and a lot of us are self-isolated, if you're struggling being on your own, if you're struggling feeling whole, complete, if you're looking for external validation, I would say this book is a good pep talk. It's also a super quick book. I think the audiobook is 1 hour, so you can just put it on for one of the evenings and just listen to it like a TED talk. It's definitely not mind-blowing, but I think a lot of people do need to hear it. It just personally wasn't applicable to my life, as ironic as it could be, considering I picked it up specifically because I thought it would be applicable to my life. I realized that reading this book is not fair because it wasn't for me. So I'm gonna say that I don't give a rating to this book because I don't have a place to give it a rating. But yeah, these were all of the books that I read in the month of July. Chat to me down below in the comments about any of the books that I mentioned in this video, or if you have any recommendations for me, let me know. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!